Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with another Isaac Asimov short story review. Now, this one appeared in a rather interesting volume, and I apologize for the glare on the surface of the book, but it's called Astounding, and the idea of this was to commemorate John W. Campbell, who had just passed away back in 1971. He barely made it to 61 years of age. That's younger than me. Kind of sobering. But he had an awesome career as someone who had taken a normal pulp, sci-fi pulp magazine of the 1930s and turned it into an extraordinary powerhouse of science fiction creativity by imposing the disciplines of having real science fiction with real science in it, and also with human aspects, with human behaviors that are realistic and reflect people as real live people with authentic personalities in the various science fiction circumstances being described. So, in short, he held science fiction writing, which up to that point had been kind of pulpish and silly and not very good. Even some early Asimov stories are kind of less than ideal, as he's going through his own slow, painful learning process. We'll have seen that in some of the earlier stories in this series. But he's come a long, long ways under the tutelage of John Campbell and emerged as a true and creditable author. So they decided to do a collection of these stories, new stories, written by all the people who were surviving from the old days. And you look at the names of the people who actually contributed to it, besides Isaac Asimov, who also contributed an introduction to this, and I find that kind of interesting. I'm going to look a little at that. But Poul Anderson, Isaac Asimov himself as a story in here, which we got to, Thiotimoline to the Stars. One more final installment in the Thiotimoline series. Again, it barely qualifies as a story. Most of it's a lecture, but it does have a lecture presented in a circumstance that allows it to be a little bit of a story. So it counts as a story. There's Alfred Bester, Al Clement, Theodore R. Cogswell, and Theodore L. Thomas working together. And then L. Sprague de Camp, Gordon R. Dixon, Harry Harrison, Mac Reynolds, Clifford D. Seamack, who's still around, George O. Smith, who's around, and Theodore Sturgeon. And then there's another story that's just by Theodore Cogswell. Oh, there's an afterword to all of this. Harry Harrison writes a little afterwards. Okay. Oh, I see. That's what you put in here, Harry Harrison. So, this book is a memorial. Well, Harry Harrison describes the purpose of this book. He says, in the early summer of 1971, Harry Harrison was asked to write a brief obituary to be published in Analog, which is what became of Astounding Science Fiction. But this was this was called Astounding. It's like to be a final issue of the Astounding Science Fiction and not Analog, even though they're really both the same magazine, because this is more the style of stories by the people who've written the stories in Astounding Science Fiction. So this is like a final issue of Astounding Science Fiction, which for most of John Campbell's career, that's what he was in charge of. He came in charge. It was already called Astounding, but it wasn't science fiction. It was something else, Astounding Stories or something. And then he changed it to Astounding Science Fiction and introduced his literary disciplines that so redefined the whole field. And then for all the 40s and all of the 50s and barely into 1960, this had been the title of his magazine, Astounding Science Fiction. Finally, he decides to graduate from the pulpish-sounding title to the full, well, we're coming into something more dignified, so we'll just call it Analog Science Fiction, because we'll deal with some factual science, even though they already dealt with certain amounts of science fact back in the old days of astounding science fiction. So they were already doing that. I should say he was the editor. So in the early summer, okay, he says he began his obituary. It is with the most profound sadness that I must report that John W. Campbell is dead. For 34 years, he was the editor of this magazine, guiding it with a firm hand from its origins in the pulse of a past era to its present stature. In shaping this journal, he shaped all of modern science fiction, so that in many ways, this entire body of literature is his memorial. Not bad. And it continues. This book is a memorial of a different kind. It is a group project, a spontaneous decision by a number of writers who decided that a special tribute was needed for this editor and friend who had been such a large part of our lives. John Campbell loved his work, and it is obvious that his magazine was as much a part of him as he was of it. What better tribute could there be than to bring out what might be called the last issue of the magazine he edited? An anthology of stories that might, perhaps, echo more of the astounding and unknown, by the way, rather than the analog. History chose the writers who are represented here, and they in turn wrote the kind of stories they knew best how to do. And then there's the same list I read them. It has been my pleasure to assemble these stories in book form and handle the mechanics of preparation. My responsibility stops here. We would have it no other way. And then there's a little quote that says, "You see, we all know who the real editor was." So, although this is done after his death, it's done with him in mind. It's done in his honor. So, Asimov has a rather interesting description of his relation with Campbell and so forth. I met him in June of 1938. Okay, only a month after he became editor. I was 18. And I'd arrived from my first story submission, my very first. That would be called me corkscrew. So he continues a little paragraph down here. It was he who gave me the skeleton of Nightfall, including the opening quotation, and sent me home to write the story. It was he who considered my third or fourth robot story, shook his head and said, "No, Isaac, you're neglecting the 3 laws of robotic, which are," and that was the first I heard of them. It was he who took the idea for a short story which I brought to him, and put it through a rich sea change that transmuted it into the Foundation series. I never denied or tried to diminish the debt I owed him, and told him flatly that everything in my writing career I owed to him, but it was characteristic of him that he never accepted that. He admitted he fed me ideas, but he said he kept on doing so only because I brought them back changed and improved. He denied that he made up the 3 laws of robotics and insisted he found them in my stories and merely put them into words. So, he talks about some of the things, how things went over the time. He never would settle down. To the end of his life, he was always experimenting, always changing, always trying to find the new and exciting. Others grew stodgy and rut-ridden with age, not Campbell. Many science fiction readers did, not Campbell. Many science fiction readers did, not Campbell. He tried Astounding in different sizes and so forth. So finally, he kept Astounding first in sales and prestige. He even changed the revered name to analog science fiction over the loud outcries of many readers, including me, but saw it through unwaveringly because he felt the new name no longer smacked of the juvenility of science fiction's magazine beginnings. Campbell championed far-out ideas, Dianetics, the Hieronymus machine, dowsing, psionics. He pained very many of the men he had trained, including me, in doing so, but felt it was his duty to stir up the minds of his readers and force curiosity right out to the border lines. He began a series of editorials in his magazine in which he championed a social point of view that could sometimes be described as far right. He expressed sympathy for George Wallace in the 1968 national elections, for instance. There was bitter opposition to this from many, including me. I could hardly read a Campbell editorial and keep my temper. Yet criticism never angered Campbell nor strained his friendship, and however idiosyncratic his views on science and society, He remained in person a sane and gentle man. I saw him last at a science fiction convention in New York, the Lunacon, in April of 1971. Wow, he's got a couple months left of life when he saw that. There he was, and spent an evening in his hotel room, while Peg Campbell, his second wife, in the last decades of his life passed in happy serenity, worked on a hooked rug. Campbell lectured us all on medicine and psychiatry. It never occurred to me when I shook hands in farewell that night that I would never see him again, never even hear his voice again. How could that occur to me when I had never once thought, never, that death and he had anything in common, could ever intersect? He was the fixed pole star about which all science fiction revolved, unchangeable, eternal. And now that he is dead, where can we find 13 people who by united effort might serve as a pale replacement for the man who, in the world of science fiction, lived a super story more thrilling than any he ever wrote? Wow. So that's what this all about is, and Asimov decided to honor John Campbell by writing his fourth and final Thiotimoline entry, and the second that, in my opinion, qualifies enough as a story to be listed in this series as a story per se. So this comes with a little squib here. In 1948, an article by Isaac Asimov appeared in Astounding. At least it looked like an article. It was titled The Endochronic Properties of Resublimated Thiotimoline. For the first time, there were revealed in great detail the abilities of a wonderful chemical that dissolved before water touched it. This remarkable process aroused such interest that in Astounding in 1953, we read about the micropsychiatric application of Thiotimoline, and with equal enthusiasm in Analog, so becoming almost fully now Analog, of 1960, The Secrets of Thiotimoline and the Space Age were published. The following is the last word in this enthralling chemical saga. The rest is the actual story, which is mostly a speech. You've got this person here, Admiral Vernon. I guess it's the graduating class of some school, and the idea is he always gives the same speech. He tells the students their one and only class, if you were, in Thiotimoline. So he says, "You've all learned what there is to know about classic theory of spaceflight. You've been filled to overflowing with astrophysics and celestial relativistic mechanics, but you have not been told about Thiotimoline. That's for a very good reason. Telling you about it in class will do you no good. You will have to learn to fly with Thiotimoline. It is Thiotimoline and that alone that will take you to the stars. With all your book learning, you may still never learn to handle Thiotimoline. If so, there will yet be many posts you can fill in the astronautic way of life. Being a pilot will, however, not be one of them. I start you off on this, your graduation day, with the only lecture you will get on the subject. After this, your dealing with Thiotimoline will be in flight, and we will find out quickly whether you have any talent for it at all." It's kind of interesting. So it seems like the ability to be a pilot working with Thiotimoline is a little bit like being in the previous story, Take a Match, being a fusionist, as he was responsible for the thermonuclear fusion to power the thing. So it's kind of similar in a way. It's like you're not so much trained in it as born in it. You have an innate ability, good for you, and that's great. You'll be an important pilot, and that's pretty central to it all. Or you won't have the native ability, but there'll be a lot of other good, useful things you could learn that'll be part of the whole picture and so forth. So he's giving this whole description of how Thiotimoline can be used in kind of pulling something forward or back a little bit in time, so that as you speed really fast across space, you can actually distort time so that it really takes the short amount of time you experience. Okay, I know it's one of these ideas that you go to this far off galaxy, you go super fast, so you get there, look around a little, get back super fast again, and you age a couple months while supposedly Earth goes on for hundreds of years or more, something like that. I have a feeling that that's based on a misreading of the equations. I just have to leave it at that. I think that's a misreading of what the equations actually mean. because I believe that during the actual acceleration process, accelerations and decelerations might do something. Yeah, I mean somehow, but the bare fact of cruising along at space at something at or near the speed of light is not going to age you more or less or different than anything else, except that to somebody behind you, you're going to look very, very slow. To somebody ahead of you, you're going to be speeded up like something ridiculous. So, red shift, blue shift. Gotta remember both sides of the equation. But at any rate, the presumption is you know, time would be somehow like this, and then where you get back in all this time. But with a little Thiotimoline, you could make it so that even for the rest of the universe, that couple of months in your age is matched by a couple of months age of the universe. And if done carefully enough, this takes a pilot who's kind of born with the night of talent. You know, you'll know who you are when you try to fly. You say, we can't train it to you. Some of you will have the knack, and the rest of you will find other jobs. You can make it so that you get back, and you've aged 2 months, and so has the universe, and everything's all nicely in sync. That's basically in a nutshell. This is obviously either an alternative or maybe a predecessor to the jump. So it's kind of it's not the jump, but like I say, it's kind of like I said, there's nothing about tachyoncy or anything like that. So there's still all this stuff that the atoms have this different thing. There's one amusing little bit. You may recall how it is in the Foundation series, the whole idea of planet Earth. Earth may be a myth. Nobody knows where it is or what it is, or even if it would have been called Earth to anybody living on it, etc., etc. So, according to this here, alright, Thiotimoline, first mentioned in 1948, according to legend, by Azimuth or possibly Asymptote, who may very likely never have existed. There is no record of the original article supposed to have been written by him, merely vague references to it, none earlier than the 21st century. Serious study began with Almirante, who either discovered Thiotimoline or rediscovered it, if the Azimuth asymptote tale is accepted. And then we go on with the career of this Almirante and so on as they experimented with Thiotimoline. So, Isaac Azimuth, Isaac Asymptote. It'd be interesting to Google those two names and see what you get. So, at any rate, that always cracks me up. I love that. Okay. At the very end, it turns out during the whole course of this lecture, they have in fact taken the entire auditorium of all the students listening on their commencement speech. They have meanwhile been taken all the way out to the planet Saturn and back, at close to the speed of light, and you didn't even feel a thing. You thought you were just sitting here in an auditorium on the surface of the Earth. Well, more fools you. We're going to come back, and we're going to be exactly at the same time we left off. Well, I'll give you part of what happens. They took off from a United Nations launch-off point or something, or somewhere in, of all places, Lincoln, Nebraska. Okay. And they end up surrounded by Indians. So, I won't spoil what that really means, other than just to give you the small hint. It doesn't mean what you would think it means. So, that story is also gathered up into by Jupiter. The penultimate story contained within this, and there is, again, a small description of how this came to be written here. So, I had a chance to do one last thing for John Campbell, by the way. It occurred to Harry Harrison, who is, by the way, the editor who collected this volume together. That name there. Harry Harrison. Just noticing, too, this is actually on, I think it's Random House. That's the same publisher that did the Opus 100 and 200, but anyway, not the usual double day. But anyway, going on. Encouraged Harry Harrison to do an anthology of stories of the kind that John Campbell had made famous by the authors he had made famous. Naturally, I was one of those authors, and in March 1972, I offered to do another Thiotimoline article. I had done 3 in my time, and they had made a considerable stir. This is the articles. And then finally, Thiotimoline is a different publisher. Okay. Now I wrote a fourth, a quarter century after the first, and it was Thiotimoline to the stars, after which comes the text, which seems to be virtually identical. The first word's all in capitals in the original. This one, they didn't do that. Same speech I propose, it ends I hate wearily. So the word same was in all caps originally. It didn't seem to be much difference. So, finally, Harry Harrison's anthology, in which Thiotimoline to the stars appeared, was called simply Astounding. It had been Harry's aim to make it one last issue of that magazine, not analog now, but Astounding. There's nothing wrong with analog, but to us old-timers, no name change can possibly replace Astounding in our hearts. And that's what I have to say about this Thiotimoline to the stars. Well, not a terribly great story in itself, but it's the last of the Thiotimoline series, such as it is, and it does have a minorly cute climax to it, but also this tribute volume, which of course is full of classic stories from the classic authors. It really is like one last hurrah, an issue of Astounding. Well, that's what I have to say on that. Thanks for listening.